Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to discuss not only the Beatles, but the Beatles breakup and who exactly was responsible for that. Now we have to take a look at it from several different angles to really get a good, clear picture regarding this breakup, and that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. Now, back in the day, there was a lot of talk about who broke up the Beatles, and usually the blame landed in one of two camps, didn't it? Fans either blamed Yoko Ono or Linda Eastman for the breakup for the most part. And out of those two, Yoko Ono received the chief amount of blame, no doubt. Her and John were getting into things that pulled him further and further away from any solidarity that he once had with his three compadres. Now, 1969 is a very interesting year, folks. It started off with the Let It Be sessions that a couple of the Beatles called Hell on Earth, okay? We've already discussed, and thanks to Peter Jackson's wonderful film, Get Back on Disney+, we discovered those sessions weren't exactly hell on earth, but still, there was a cooling off and there was a frustration in getting a massive amount of material together in a very short period of time, right? But you know, after those sessions, around September, at a very heated discussion at a Apple meeting, John Lennon let the rest of the Beatles know that he was done and that he wanted a divorce. Now, that wasn't too much of an alarm there. John was the kind of person who would say one thing and the very next day not only change his mind, but often not even remember that he had said it before. The Beatles saying that at one point he even announced that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and that dissipated about as quickly as that statement startled them. So the Beatles decided to just quietly not announce any breakups, and this would allow John to possibly change his mind, perhaps even getting more energized for a brand new project, perhaps him even coming up with the idea of it. But that's not how it played out. By the spring of the very next year, the Beatles were kaput. And with most casual fans either blaming the Beatles themselves and or a couple of their wives. But you know, the announcement that the Beatles had broken up really came from an interview, granted, an interview that Paul McCartney more or less manufactured so that he could get the word out for his brand new album, McCartney. And in that interview, he stated that he did not foresee a time in the future that he would ever work with the Beatles again. But you know, even after that, I personally think there was still a chance that the Beatles could have regrouped. You know, it wasn't uncommon in those days. There would be a kerfluffle within a group, they would break up, and within 18 months, they were back together or trying to get back together. I think at this point in time, this could have been a very real possibility. But you see, there were other villains in this plot, weren't there? First of all, Alan Klein arrived on the scene, didn't he? After repeated attempts of getting on the Beatle team. When the Beatles asked the Rolling Stones about Klein, they said cryptically, he's all right, he'll make you money. But beyond just that, they weren't overly impressed with the man. He somehow wedged himself right into the middle of the Beatle team. Now, you've got to understand something at this point. The Beatles had an unwritten, ironclad rule, all for one for all. Anything that they did, it had to be a unanimous decision. And here, for the first time in Beatle history, Alan Klein was voted in to as the Beatles manager by John Lennon primarily, with George Harrison and Ringo Starr eventually siding with John because Paul had suggested that his in-laws actually represent the Beatles, and they didn't like that idea, so they sided with John. So here, for the first time, we have a divided Beatles. Paul on the outside, the other three together in a decision. Now, there's no doubt Alan Klein made money for his clients, but he always managed to do that by making even more money for himself, and eventually his whole way of doing business would come out, and history proves the man was a jerk. Alan Klein was not there to serve the Beatles. Alan Klein was always there to serve Alan Klein. But right around this time, and with the help of Alan Klein, who else shows up? You see, Phil Spector was brought in to remaster and to fix the tapes from the Let It Be sessions, after they had already decided just to let the project lie fallow. And this was suggested by Alan Klein because, you see, the Beatles owed one more album, and he thought this would be a quick and economical way of delivering that promised album. And so he brings in Phil Spector with the blessing of 3 out of 4 Beatles, and Phil Spector's heavy-handed approach almost destroyed that album, if you ask me. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the Let It Be original album as it is fantastic. The Beatles didn't do anything that wasn't fantastic, but in its form, as it was delivered to us in 1970, it was not one of their strongest efforts. And part of the reason I believe this was true was the very heavy-handed approach that producer Phil Spector put on that album. A good example of that that's always been brought up is the song Long Winding Road, adding a female choir to that, which for the most part the Beatles never did. It wasn't even considered part of the Beatles sound, and a very syrupy orchestration that Paul did not like. This would further alienate Paul. And you know what? Alan Klein and Phil Spector are but two of a trio. Yes, an axis of evil that existed in rock and roll at that time, and they had their talons gripped tightly into the Beatles. But before we get to that third individual here, let's discuss Phil Spector a little bit further. You know, Phil Spector would continue to work quite heavily with John Lennon and George Harrison. And you know what? I really, truly like Phil Spector as a producer. He's probably my second or third favorite producer in rock and roll. I don't like the man. I don't like his whole way of, interacting with his artists. I think he has a treacherous and slippery slope of a history, and well, we all know what happened to him. But you know, it was during these early months, just post-Beatles, and perhaps for up to 2 years, this man was constantly not only producing John and George's records, but constantly slipping in little things to say, like, oh, this track, George, oh, it'll bury anything that Paul McCartney would ever possibly do. Or, hey, John, you know, that song will really sock Paul right in the eye like he deserves. This man was nothing but a very small man. Not just in stature, but a small man, a small human being. He's the guy you do not want in your group of friends if you want to stay in good fashion with them anyway. And then came the infamous Rolling Stone interviews, and along with that, of course, Jan Wenner. Now, if you've seen even 5 of my videos, you've probably heard me say a couple of things about this guy. He is not good for rock and roll as far as I'm concerned, and during those years, he was heavily into Lennon's camp. Now, Rolling Stone wasn't the only publication that jumped on to the Lennon bandwagon in those days, but those publications did not have the relationship that Jan Wenner had with John Lennon. You know, there was a viewing of Let It Be just before it was released, and it was John, Jan, and Yoko who were there. And the film was purposefully edited to make Yoko look bad and to make John look disinterested. And you know what? John and Yoko thought that was just cool. Of course, with the encouragement of Jan. Jan Wenner would later tell one of his writers, who was going to give Paul McCartney's wonderful Ram album a good positive review, to reverse that and to give it a negative review. Now we begin to see a clearer picture that explains a little bit more precisely, a little bit more clearly as to why the Beatles, when they did break up, and that breakup, by the way, was very, very tenuous, and why they would never, ever reunite. It wasn't Linda. It wasn't even Yoko, and as far as I'm concerned, it really wasn't the Beatles. I really do believe John could have easily have been enticed back into the Beatles if the right project had shown up. With friends like these, the Beatles really truly didn't need any enemies. And there were many enemies by this time. A lot of the love that the press was showing the Beatles earlier in their career, as they got more radical, the press became more hypercritical. The charmed life that the Beatles had experienced for the first 2/3 of their career was gone. Now, people have said many times that Paul McCartney is the artist that suffered the most from the Beatles breakup, with George Harrison's magnificent All Things Must Pass, Spector produced, folks. I love that album, and I don't like what they're doing with the remixes, taking him off. He shouldn't have been on Let It Be, but he was fine there, and he was really good with John Lennon too. And of course, with John getting more radical and stripping his music down for the magnificent Plastic Ono Band album. Oh my goodness. People said that Paul kind of lost his way for a couple of years. Really? The McCartney album is losing your way? The Ram album is losing your way? And you know what? He got no love from the critics until Band on the Run was finally released. McCartney and Ram are masterpieces, folks. Nothing short of a masterpiece. And guess what? Decades later, the critics are now slowly re-evaluating those albums. Actually, not even slowly anymore. Most people now giving in and acknowledging that Ram and McCartney are both post-Beatle masterpieces. For us who followed McCartney right out of the Beatles, we knew they were masterpieces the whole time. But it did affect sales, and it did affect how the world viewed McCartney. And so we see the Beatles as a newly broken up team were further divided. In the end, we got the Beatles breaking up, and while the wound was still open, and while the wound could still be healed, we have Phil Spector in there chit-chatting his way and further dividing the team. We have Jan Wenner doing the same. By the way, Phil Spector was put into place by who? Alan Klein. If you ask me, these three clowns are the ones that broke up the Beatles, or at least assured that that breakup was permanent.